With that, now I'd like to begin my little talk on clinical trials and what they are. I'd like just once again to get a show of hands of how many people have ever participated in a clinical trial. So there's a good number of you. That's excellent. The traditional rate that's thrown around of people who are actually eligible to participate in cancer patients who are eligible to participate in clinical trials is between 3 and 6%. So that's a number that we at the Cancer Research Institute would love to see. That's something that we're trying to do, and as part of this program, we hope that by teaching those of you who don't know about clinical trials, what they are and how they might benefit you, that you will take advantage of them if that becomes part of your option for treatment. So, what are clinical trials? We've heard, obviously, research is the middle name of the Cancer Research Institute, and that's what clinical trials are. They're like carefully controlled studies, except they're done in humans. It's often the first time that new drugs are tested in humans, or it's the first time that a new combination or different way of delivering existing drugs are given to patients. They're designed to answer very specific questions, and so we heard earlier a little bit about all the criteria that need to be met if someone's determined to be eligible to enter a clinical trial. And the reason for all of these criteria are, again, these are scientific studies. You've got to really control all those variables so you can figure out what's causing something to happen versus what's not relevant. And then, of course, the overall goal of clinical trials is to improve patient outcomes. So we want to get better medicines that work more safely and more effectively than the existing treatments. And ultimately, we want to get to cures for all cancers. So clinical trials are an integral part of the research spectrum. At the beginning of this chart, you see there can be anywhere between 5,000 to 10,000 compounds or drugs that are discovered or are determined to potentially have some applicability in treating cancer. Then those are studied and moved in the ones that make it into the next phase. You see there are far fewer, about 250 might make it out of that up to 10,000 drugs. And then this begins to enter what's called preclinical testing. Before it goes into patients, we do laboratory studies with the drug to see if we're getting potential effects that we want to hopefully generate within patients as well. Then you have the clinical trial phase, and that's that area in the middle. And there are typically 3 phases of trials, and even fewer drugs make it to trials. And then maybe if you're lucky, one gets to FDA approval. So we're going to focus on that middle section there. We're going to talk about the different phases of trials and what they seek to answer. So the first trial is a very basic question: is this treatment safe? As I said, in the case where a treatment is given to people for the very first time, these studies are often very small. You don't want to give 1,000 people a new drug all at once for the very first time. You want to start 1 patient, 2 patient. The accrual process there is very slow and deliberate, and those patients are monitored extensively, biologically, scans, blood draws, everything to see, how is this drug potentially affecting the patient. They also aim to find what's the optimal dose in treating patients. So they'll often scale at the lowest doses at the very beginning of the study, and then as they become more and more as the researchers become more comfortable with the safety profile of the drug, they increase it until they reach a threshold where you either see diminishing effects or you see increased toxicities, and you determine that safest dose. And then we look for those side effects. Are you having a bad reaction to this medicine, and if why? The second phase, if something gets through that first phase and it looks like there's some signals there that this may have benefit, and in the case of immunotherapy, you sometimes see these signals very early on in those phase 1 studies or phase 2 studies, and there have been drug approvals based on just phase 2 studies. So the second phase, though, says, does it work? Does the drug work? We know it's safe, but does it do anything? So this is where the trials are designed to look specifically at the effect the drugs are having on the patient. patients. Are you seeing a reduction in the size of the tumor? Are you seeing disease stabilization? Are the patients, do they have a better quality of life? Do they report, that they feel better? These are all important questions that tell us whether or not something's working. And then, of course, we're always looking for those side effects and making sure that the patient is safe. And these are larger trials because we are more comfortable with them, and so they can range anywhere from 100 to 500 patients. Now, once you start to get what's called, data about the effectiveness of these drugs, then we go into the really big phase 3 trial. And these phase 3 trials are what the FDA in our country requires in order to make a determination about approval for a drug. And so in order to do that, you need what's called statistical relevance. And all that means is you need a lot of people and you need a lot of data. So to do that, these trials also ask the question, of course, what does the drug work better? So we know it's safe, we know it works, but does it work better than what we have out there already? And so these trials are often designed to compare existing standard of care with a new treatment, or existing standard of care with existing standard of care, but given in a different way or with a different drug or different combination. And then also looking at the risk versus benefit. This is where you get real indication of whether or not a drug or a combination of drugs prolongs survival, and even you might see in a very few cases extreme responders, people who go into complete remission, their cancer goes away. So these are the 3 phases of trials. We at the Cancer Research Institute have a clinical program that focuses primarily on the earlier phases, the 1 and 2. To get to those big phase 3 trials, though, you need big dollars, and that's where industry comes in, and they work with academics to make sure that these studies are designed in the optimal way. So what are the pros and cons of clinical trials? So some of the advantages: you're getting access to the best possible care. You have a research team, a clinical team, a nursing team, a whole healthcare team that's focused just on you and how you're doing in this trial. You will get access to new drugs before they're widely available, and this has saved the lives of some patients. Of course, there's that close monitoring, making sure that you're okay. Then you also get the opportunity as a volunteer patient in these studies to participate in the research process. Earlier, Jill O'Donnell-Tormey mentioned that patients are integral to this and that we can't do it without you. The field cannot move forward. We can't get to cures without the participation of patient volunteers in these trials. And then you help future generations. Of course, the ultimate hope, or the immediate hope, is that you benefit, and that's the hope that your care team has for you as well. In terms of potential disadvantages, these are new drugs. Some of them, as I said, haven't been tested in humans before, so the side effects are unknown. There is an element of risk to doing this. We've heard of trials where new drugs are given, and some patients have extreme, what are called adverse events. These are really bad side effects that in some cases can produce fatalities. That's a risk. But fortunately, as we've heard today, we're learning so much more about how these drugs work in patients, and those side effect risk profiles are coming down and down. They're reducing the level of risk that a patient has to take on before entering a trial, and that's a good thing. You also don't know if there are any benefits. Like, is this going to work? How is it going to work? Will it work as it's supposed to be? Am I going to grow hair in weird places? I don't know. This is just something. Not all patients may benefit. I've never heard of anyone growing hair, by the way, in treatment with immunotherapy. Not all patients may benefit, of course, and we know that this is the case with any approved drug. Even in chemotherapy, some patients get chemo and they do remarkably well and they go on to live their lives and their cancer never comes back. Or they get surgery, it's caught early enough, never happens. But that doesn't happen in the case of any of those drugs, and it certainly doesn't happen in the case of all the drugs that are tested in clinical trials. Another potential, or could be perceived as a disadvantage, is you are part of a study, and as part of joining that study, you do sign up to get all the blood tests, all the tissue samples, all the scans, whatever it is that your health team needs to gather the data they need to prove that this is an effective treatment. Often, this also requires many visits to the clinic. If you're in the case of receiving treatment at a clinic that's very far from your home, that can be an economic burden as well as a burden on time and your family. So that's something to consider. As you know, yeah, of course, the need to travel to trial sites. Not everyone has access to transportation or can afford it. The good news is that a lot of the larger studies, the phase 3 studies, are, because they're pretty well understood relatively in the research process. The community oncology clinics are comfortable running these, and we actually need to do these in the community. That's how you get access to all the patients that you need for these studies. The earlier phase, the 1 and 2, the really highly experimental, are more commonly available at academic research centers like here at Columbia University Medical Center, Memorial Sloan Kettering or NYU Langone, Perlmutter Cancer Center. So the good thing is, you know, most of you we know are from the area. You either live in the city or nearby, and you have in your backyard some of the best cancer treatment centers in the world. So we're very fortunate that we're here in New York City for that. Before you volunteer, and again, I stress this is a volunteer, we're going to talk about later that you do have the option of opting out. There's some questions you want to think about, and as a reminder, we are going to share these slides with you, so you don't need to write these all down, but you want to know why is the trial being done? And these are questions that you ask your care team, you ask your oncologist, you ask whoever's on the nurse practitioner on the study. They can be very helpful in answering all these questions, and don't be afraid to ask. It's why do you think this treatment is going to work better than what's available? You know, why do you think it's going to work better in me is also a very good question. We heard earlier why, Karen said, why should she get the chemotherapy if we know it's not going to work? What are the other options that are available? Are there other standard treatments I can try before I move on to clinical trials? Are there other trials that may be better for me? You can also ask, in the case of a phase 2 study, that means there was a phase 1 study, and you can ask the doctor, how did those patients do? Why did they think this was worth taking into phase 2, or why did they think this was worth taking into phase 3? How long will the trial last? You can be on a trial for a year or 2 years, or you can be on a trial indefinitely, depending on how the study is structured. We've heard of patients receiving treatment, and even when treatment stops, they're still required to come in for scans periodically, because you really want that long-term data, that chart that Dr. Drake showed us where the tumors shrink and those lines go down, and then you have that long tail of people surviving. People who tend to benefit for a while, but in order to prove that, you need to come back in and get your scans so we know for sure. Can you continue receiving the treatment when the trial ends? Sometimes a treatment's so successful, it's approved by the FDA and becomes standard of care, and you can get it that way. Some trials will allow you to continue receiving treatment. Some doctors, if the drug is available and they can give it to you and you're able to get it, that why not, if it seems to be working for you. You want to know what kind of procedures or tests will be done. You want to know how will the trial impact your daily life in terms of travel, and do you need to have someone there with you? Will you need to stay overnight? Will you need to be hospitalized? And then of course, what costs, if any, will be your responsibility to pay. Now, many trials are sponsored, or almost all of them are, and the drug cost, when you're a patient in a clinical trial, you don't pay for the drug and you don't pay for the treatment that's directly, and the scans that are directly associated with that trial, but you still may have all the other costs associated with your care in general. So these are good things to sort out, because you want to know what's the financial impact going to be. Unfortunately, that's a very real consequence for many of us. So getting into a trial, it's great. So there are all these trials. In fact, in immunotherapy, there's somewhere around 3,000 clinical trials right now going on, testing new immunotherapies and combinations of immunotherapies and multiple types of cancers. And that's because we're very hopeful that it's going to work based on the data that we've seen so far. But getting into those trials isn't a given. You have to meet those eligibility criteria. I said earlier, this is because we need to make sure the data are accurate and meaningful. But this also works to your benefit. Because of all these stringent controls, we know that giving this drug to you because you have this genetic profile, or if you've received this treatment in the past, that you're either not likely to respond, or you may even be more inclined to have an adverse response, a bad side effect from getting this treatment. So let's consider some other options. So it's not always a bad thing, that you don't get into a trial. And in fact, we've heard from patients who have been turned down from trials. Our patient speaker last year, Janie Furling, had to try 2 or 3 times before she was finally able to get into a trial, and that ultimately wound up working for her. But some of the common criteria that are used in screening patients for trials, you'll see on the screen here, it's the cancer type and stage, your history, genetic factors, your age, your medical history, and your current health status. This is just a smattering of these, and often when you're handed this document that lists all the eligibility criteria, it can be very, very overwhelming. But take a look at them, and if something stands, ask your healthcare again. They're there to answer your questions. So there are a lot of myths about clinical trials. The one that I hear a lot is that there's a risk of you're just going to get placebo. There may be something that works, but if I go into this trial, I might get nothing at all. And the truth is that, placebos are used on very rare occasion, but almost never are they given in the absence of any treatment option. If there's something available ethically, your doctors want to treat you. They certainly don't want to lead you on that there's hope that you're getting treatment. The placebos may be involved when you're testing something in combination with a standard of care. So you may say, okay, we know standard of care, we give these patients this chemotherapy regimen, and the trial is going to be that standard chemotherapy regimen plus the drug or plus nothing. Trials are only for people who have run out of treatment options. They're nothing but a last resort. Well, the truth is that trials are designed for people with all stages of cancer and all cancer types. There's a lot of optimism, as I said, in immunotherapy. And what we're seeing also is that immunotherapy may benefit people earlier on in the process. Earlier this year, it was announced that giving patients, lung cancer patients who are eligible to have their tumors removed surgically, traditionally you might treat them with chemotherapy first and then remove them or not give them anything. Now we know that if you give them immunotherapy first, they may have a better response in the long term, or they may have a more durable response. That's a very early study. We need to do, that was a phase 1, I think, or phase 2, but we need to get those numbers to know if that really bears out across the broader population. But it's very hopeful. And there's also a lot of interest in giving immunotherapy to patients earlier on in their treatment history, before they've gone through round after round of chemotherapy and radiation, before their immune systems have been completely depleted, and they're just in very weak state of health. Might we do better giving patients earlier on these immunotherapies when they're healthier and their immune systems are stronger? The myth is I need to travel to a large hospital to participate in a clinical trial. I talked about this earlier. As I said, the larger studies are typically available, but trials are taking place everywhere, local hospitals as well as the major academic centers. And when as part of the search for a clinical trial, when you're looking for a trial for yourself, there's a thing in there about trial sites, and you can see where these trials where the trial is taking place. Often it's in multiple sites. You can even search along those criteria. You could say, I only want to go to trials in near Reno, Nevada, if there are any, and you could search that way and find one that's closer to you. Health insurance doesn't cover the entire cost of care in a clinical trial, and that's not entirely, that's both a myth and a fact, of course. The doctors, as I said, the doctor's visits, hospital stays, and testing procedures may be covered by your insurance, and then the trial costs are covered by the sponsor. That's a conversation that's yet another conversation your caregiver needs to have with your insurance company and with the hospital to make sure that everything's lining up and all the things that you are having done to you are covered under your insurance. Signing a consent form locks you into staying in a trial. That's a myth. I said earlier, you're a volunteer. That means you're free to change your mind whenever you want. If you just don't feel like going on for whatever reason, that's entirely in your prerogative. It's a decision that should be made just as carefully as the decision to enter the trial, and it's something that you should discuss with your oncologist and your healthcare team. Let them know why you no longer want to participate. You'll be made to feel like a guinea pig. Now, Karen Kohler earlier used that phrase. She said, make me your guinea pig. I don't care. Give me whatever you got. Some people are comfortable with that. Other people, the idea of being a subject in a study, can be very alienating and off-putting. But the truth is that most patients who participate in these trials walk away saying that they felt that they were part of the healthcare team. They were always involved, always consulted, and they had a really positive experience as a result. Clinical trials aren't safe. These are high risk, dangerous. I said before that, depending on the phase of the study, the risk profile gets lower and lower. But even with the earliest phase studies, with the most experimental treatments, there are still an enormous number of stringent controls that are put in place by the regulatory agencies, by the academic centers or institutions where the trials are being launched. There's lots of internal review. There's safety and monitoring boards. And at all times, patients must be informed of their rights and safety, and that these rights are protected. So informed consent means basically getting all the facts before you make, entering a trial is not a decision to be made lightly. For some people, it's a no-brainer, but for you, it may not be. Make sure that you understand what's the purpose, what's the length, what are the risks, what are the benefits, expectations, what are my rights, alternatives, what are the safeguards, and how do I get out if I don't want it anymore? Get all of this information up front. And if you don't get it up front, ask it next time you're in front of your healthcare team. It's your treatment plan, so be bold. Advocate for yourself, or in the case of a loved one, advocate for your loved one who's going through cancer. So how do you find a clinical trial? Easiest way is to ask your doctor, but sometimes not all doctors are up to date on the latest advances in clinical research. You might want to ask another doctor if necessary. If your doctor, some oncologists are still, in the case of immunotherapy, which is relatively new, are uncomfortable or don't believe that immunotherapy works. And so you may need to confront that bias and seek a second opinion. You can also contact a patient advocacy organization. Many of the cancer-specific organizations are paying very close attention to trials and the latest research in specific types of cancer. So if you've got that and there's an organization that deals with that type of cancer or group of cancers, feel free to, and I strongly encourage you to seek their assistance. Also at the Cancer Research Institute, we have a clinical trial finder service. Some of you have made appointments with clinical trial navigators here at the summit. They'll sit with you, they'll ask you questions about your medical history, they'll ask you where do you want to be treated, what other conditions do you have, they'll plug that into the database, and out will come, hopefully, trials for which you may be eligible. They give you that, and then you're able to take the next step, which is to contact the trial coordinators and see about getting yourself onto that trial. You can also search online. We at the Cancer Research Institute have a clinical trial. This is how you can find our clinical trials finder service. But then also all the trials that are registered in the U.S. are centrally registered with the U.S. government. You can browse them at clinicaltrials.gov. If this is your first time looking for trials, that can be very daunting. It's a complicated process. This is where a navigator can really help you find your way through that. Still, if you have stomach for it, and you're just curious, go on in. It's a free service.